Erie, Pennsylvania, and I was going to Erie, Pennsylvania. I was coming from Cleveland, Ohio to Erie, Pennsylvania. It's about a 90-mile car journey. I was sitting in the back of the car, somebody else was driving. I was sitting next to this fellow. He was a work colleague from California. I was going to be sitting next to him for 90 minutes, so I thought I'll try and be polite. I'll ask him where he'd been on holiday that year. So I asked him where he'd been on holiday that year, and he told me he'd been over in Oxford in the UK on missionary work. I didn't think they sent missionaries to Oxford in the UK, but apparently they do, from California. So that kind of sparked my curiosity, as of course it was fully intended to, and the conversation turned to matters spiritual. The upshot of the conversation was he sent me a few books that he thought I might help with the questions I had. Sure enough, 2 weeks later I received a copy in the post of The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel and the Bible. Now, did reading The Case for Christ turn me into a Christian? Well, no, it didn't. But what it did do, though, is it was acting as my starting point into this discovering who Jesus was and is. I was amazed at the evidence I found. I was amazed at my ignorance of the evidence I found. How could I be living in a Christian country and not be aware of this stuff? So the reason I'm presenting this evening is I kind of think it's important to share the information I found with others and allow them to draw their own conclusions. Anyway, enough of me. Let's get into the meat of the presentation. So, when you read the booklet you get at the end of the presentation, you'll see about half of it is devoted to reviewing the sources of evidence we have for Jesus and assessing how reliable those sources are. For tonight, I've tried to provide a brief summary of this, but before I do that, I just want to cover one key topic. That is, many people out there, and maybe some people in here, I don't know, think that Jesus was mythical. He never existed. Well, that's not the view of today's historians that specialise in this period of history. I pulled this statement straight off Wikipedia, and it gives I know Wikipedia has its limits, and some people regard it as not very reliable, but what it says is the historicity of Jesus is the question of not whether Jesus, the central figure of Christianity, historically existed as being opposed to a purely mythical figure. Virtually all scholars of antiquity argue that Jesus existed. The contrary perspective that Jesus was mythical is regarded as a fringe theory. So, today's historians that specialise in this period of history are all agreed that Jesus did exist. And here's a statement by a guy called Bart Ehrman. I don't know if any of you have come across Bart Ehrman before. Yep, one person. Bart Ehrman's a preeminent Jesus scholar in America, but he's also an agnostic. And he wrote a book called Did Jesus Exist? And in it he says, whatever else you may think about Jesus, he certainly did exist. So, we're taking Jesus' existence as read for this evening. I think it's a perfectly reasonable assumption to make. The question is, I suppose, was Jesus who he said he was? And that's what we're going to focus on this evening. Okay, so what are the sources of evidence we've got for Jesus? Well, we've got the 4 Gospels in the Bible, the letters of Paul, James and Jude in the Bible, the Gospels of Jesus that didn't make it into the Bible, often called the Apocryphal Gospels, written sources from outside the Bible dated to shortly after Jesus' life, archaeological evidence and circumstantial evidence. Now, I had a conversation about circumstantial evidence with the guy that runs a fish and chip shop down in the front earlier on this evening. He would ask me what I was doing this evening, so I told him anyway. They were I think of these, probably the most overlooked is that last one, circumstantial evidence. I'd like to think about this for a minute. If you think about this, Christianity has existed on this planet for a very long time. Christianity has more followers today than any other religion on earth. However, we know there was a time when there were no Christians on this planet. So, why are there Christians today? Well, rational cause and effect tells us that at some point in the past something must have happened, some cause, that had the effect of compelling some people who weren't Christians to become the first Christians. Now that might sound like stating the obvious, and I suppose it is. But for all of us, atheists, agnostics, Christians, those of other faiths, that provides a direct challenge. Cause and effect tells us that the start of Christianity is a historical event. As a result, when and why Christianity started can be studied like any other historical event. The key point historians of all faiths and no faith have been doing this very thing for about 200 years. The key point we mustn't lose sight of is that something pretty momentous must have happened to cause all the Christianity we see all around us today. Something pretty momentous must have happened to start it all in the first place. And given all the historical research that's been directed to finding out what happened, all of us, you, me, can come to our own informed view of what we think happened. So let's have a very brief look at what the sources historians use for their research. Let's start with the Gospels. Okay. When I was an agnostic, I thought the 4 Gospels in the Bible were theological texts written hundreds of years after the time Jesus was supposed to have lived, and the Gospels we read today were substantially revised and doctored versions of what probably had been written in the first place. In other words, I thought they couldn't be used as the basis for historical research on Jesus. I was very surprised to find that the general view amongst today's historians that specialise in this period of history was very, very different. The current view is that the Gospel of Mark was written around 60 to 70 AD. That's about 30 to 40 years after Jesus died. With the Gospel of Matthew and Luke written around 10 to 15 years after Mark. And the Gospel of John written around about 90 AD. I was surprised to find there are many thousands of early Gospel manuscripts, some from as early as the 2nd century AD, that exist today. And I was also surprised to find that when these manuscripts are compared using a technique that historians use called textual criticism, it's found that these documents look to be pretty accurate versions of what was originally written. In other words, historians are of the view that the Gospels haven't been substantially altered, either deliberately to fit in with later theology or accidentally as part of the handwritten copying process to produce documents before the invention of printing in the Middle Ages. So, historians can tell us that the Gospels are pretty accurate versions of what was originally written. But are the Gospels accurate descriptions of what actually happened? Well, I suppose the answer in part comes from the dates the Gospels were written. As I said a few minutes ago, the Gospel of Mark was written around 30 to 40 years after Jesus died. Now, life expectancy was shorter in those days. However, when the Gospels were written, there'd still be a good chance that some of the people who had actually seen and heard Jesus would still be alive. In short, there'd be still first-hand witnesses alive for Jesus' life, first-hand witnesses of Jesus' life available to draw upon for information and to put in the Gospels, and of course to challenge what was written down if it was inaccurate. Also, a span of 30 to 40 years really doesn't give much time for legends and myths to develop about Jesus. Now, there's a general rule of thumb amongst historians that the longer the time period between an event occurring and it being written about, the greater the chances of legendary material getting into the narrative. The 30 to 40 year time span with Jesus is, in historical terms, very short. For comparison, the earliest biographies we have of Alexander the Great were written more than 400 years after his death. These were written by Arrian and Plutarch. These are the biographies that we base our knowledge of Alexander the Great upon. So, From a historian's perspective, there's a very good chance that the Gospels are pretty accurate representations of Jesus' life, given they were written very shortly after the actual events being described. Okay, well, what about the differences in the Gospels, you might say? Now, it's well known there are some apparent differences in the details of the Gospels. I'm saying apparent because they can be explained away, but they're still there. For example, the number of people that find Jesus' tomb empty varies between the Gospels. The detail of the birth narrative varies between the Gospels. There isn't a birth narrative at all in Mark's Gospel and John's Gospel. The order of some of the events in Jesus' life vary from Gospel to Gospel. In one Gospel we find Jesus' mother Mary being told clearly that the child she's about to give birth to is the Son of God. Yet in another Gospel we're told that Jesus' mother and family tried to stop him in his ministry, saying that he was out of his mind. Odd behaviour if you knew your son was God's son. Now, it's also well known that John's Gospel, the style and content of John's Gospel, that is the one written last, is quite different from the other three and more, I guess, theologically developed than the other ones. Does that not reduce the credibility of the information in that Gospel? Well, extensive review of the Gospels by historians in the last 200 years has led to the consensus view that the Gospels were written at least semi-independently and were drawing from oral histories of more than one early Christian community. Unsurprisingly, there would be slight variations between these oral histories, and that would be reflected in the Gospels. Also, as John's Gospel was written once Christianity and Christian theology were more developed, it's unsurprising that is reflected in the content of that Gospel. However, I think what is surprising is that these differences exist in the Bibles we read today. What this clearly tells us is that these awkward differences have been left in, lending evidential weight to the view that the Gospels we read today are pretty accurate versions of what was originally written. Now, that's all I'm going to say on gospel reliability tonight. We're going to it in far more depth in the booklet you'll get at the end of the presentation. Let's move on to Paul's letters now. Another source of evidence we can use is Paul's letters. These were written to various early Christian communities in Rome and other locations in the eastern part of the Roman Empire. Now, these were written around 15 to 25 years after Jesus died. So all Paul's letters predate the Gospels. Now, there's a general view amongst historians that the majority of the letters of Paul in the Bible were genuinely written, dictated by Paul himself. Now, that's not to say the other ones are forgeries. It just means there's more historical debate about the other ones, about their genuineness and accuracy. In the letters, it's clear evidence that Christian worship and belief were already well developed. Logic tells us this must have happened earlier than 15 to 25 years after Jesus died. One example of this is a passage from Paul's letter to the Corinthians. That's 1 Corinthians chapter 15. This is one of the letters historians are confident was actually written by Paul. And it says, "Now, brothers, I want to remind you of the gospel I preached to you, which you've received and which you've taken your stand. By this gospel you're saved, if you hold firmly to the word I preached to you, otherwise you believed in vain. For what I received I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Peter and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, he appeared to me also as to one abnormally born." Okay. Why is that passage important? Well, as I mentioned before, Paul's letter to the Corinthians is regarded by historians as genuine. The passage we've just seen and heard is also regarded by historians as genuine. In other words, it doesn't look like a later addition. And what it shows is that at least as early as 15 to 25 years after Jesus' death, and most likely earlier than that, the central message of Christianity was the death and resurrection of Jesus and what it meant. Okay, that's all I'm going to say in Paul's letters this evening. As I say, we go into far more depth in the booklet you'll get at the end. What I'm going to cover now, the Apocryphal Gospels. Now, there are many other accounts, Gospels if you like, of Jesus' life that aren't in the Bible. Some of these Gospels have survived to the present day and are available for both historians and the general public to read and study. Now, you might have heard about 10 years ago, archaeologists unearthed the Gospel of Judas Iscariot. This is one of many other Gospels, such as the Gospel of Thomas, the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Pseudo-Matthew, and so on. These apocryphal Gospels, as they are known, were either written well into the 2nd century AD or later. They often contain more fanciful and supernatural accounts of Jesus' life, just as historians might expect from that rule of thumb I described a minute ago. That is, the longer the time period elapsing between an event occurring and it being written about, the greater the chances of legendary material getting into the narrative. Historians use these apocryphal Gospels for studying on the life of Jesus. However, they're probably more useful for studying the 2nd and 3rd century Christian community beliefs that they sprung from. Okay, another source of evidence we've got are contemporary non-Christian written sources. Now, a reasonable question to ask is, why are there no surviving documents describing Jesus' life from the time of Jesus? The argument goes, if the events of Jesus' life were so momentous, why were they not written about by other writers at the time? Now, although we don't ultimately know for certain why that is, we suggest that the likely answer is rather mundane if we consider who might have recorded that. That is, the Jewish, Roman, and Greek scribes writing for the Jewish and Roman authorities. Now, from a Jewish and Roman authorities' perspective, I think Jesus would have been seen as just another Jewish holy man who stirred up the Jews in Jerusalem and was quickly dealt with before he could cause any real trouble. These events were occurring in a tiny part of the Roman Empire where this kind of thing happened regularly. It would have been hardly worthy of a mention. What I've tried to do in this slide, when I was putting this presentation together, I was interested to find out what was going on in the Roman Empire about the time of Jesus' mission. And you can see there was quite a lot. They were fighting Germanic tribes up here. They were fighting these blokes here. How do you pronounce that? I've been saying Dacians for the last 18 years, and I saw a car ad. It was spelled like that. Dacians. What do you reckon? No idea. Fine, okay. Well, you're no help to me. Anyway, right. They were fighting these unpronounceable blokes up here. This was caused major disruption through the empire. Tiberius had gone into semi-retirement because he was fed up with of Rome. So he went into semi-retirement. He put basically de facto control of the empire in the hands of this fellow Sejanus. He was the head of the Praetorian Guard. What Sejanus then did was he appointed various placemen throughout the empire that were loyal to him, so that he just consolidated his control over the empire. Now, Pontius Pilate looks to be one of those people. And what happens in John's Gospel is kind of interesting, because it kind of points to there's two dates for Jesus' crucifixion, AD 30 and AD 33. I won't go into the details just now, but some of the details in John's Gospel look maybe it's pointing to AD 33, because in about 31 AD, Tiberius thought Sejanus was getting a bit big for his boots and had him murdered and had his entire family murdered. And of course that then put all his placemen in a rather difficult situation. They were all very, very keen to show their loyalty to the emperor. It's interesting, in John's Gospel, the Jewish authorities say to Pontius Pilate, pointing to Jesus, "This man claims to be king of the Jews. We've only got one king, but that's King Caesar. If you let this man live, you're no friend of Caesar's." So that might have something to do with the way Pilate reacted. Of course, he had Jesus executed. We can maybe talk about that later if you want to explore that in more detail. Yeah, that might have some. Might point to the fact that that crucifixion was in AD 33, possibly. I think you'd agree that all these things happening in the empire are more important from Roman eyes than some itinerant Jewish preacher causing a bit of trouble in the bottom right-hand corner of your empire. If the Jewish authorities had written about Jesus, it would have had to survive the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans in AD 70 and AD 135. I won't go into the details of the uprisings at those times and the Roman response, other than to say the Romans ultimately flattened the city, destroyed the Jewish temple completely, and either killed or scattered the Jewish inhabitants. Not ideal conditions for the survival of documents, particularly in Jewish eyes, the less sacred, less important non-sacred documents. Okay, is that it? Well, no. Although there are no reliable early non-Christian documents describing Jesus' life, there are a number of non-Christian documents describing Jesus' early followers. In the booklet we provide a more extensive review of these documents and what they say. However, for tonight there's really just one reference I'd like to focus on. That is Tacitus. Now in 115 AD, Tacitus, the Roman historian, wrote a history of Rome. He describes how Nero persecuted Christians as scapegoats to divert suspicion away from himself for the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD. Now, what does that admittedly brief mention of Christians tell us? Well, one thing it tells us is there were sufficient numbers of people who saw themselves as Christians in Rome in 64 AD to be singled out for attention by Nero. Now, if you think about this, to be a persecuted minority, there have to be sufficient numbers of that minority to come to the attention of the majority. To use a contemporary example, consider asylum seekers in the UK. There have been people seeking asylum in the UK for hundreds of years. I mean, we can go back to the 18th century with the Huguenots from France. However, they've been only begun to be seen as a group called asylum seekers when their numbers grew significantly around the turn of the millennium. So the reference in Tacitus tells us that less than 35 years after Jesus' death, there was a Christian community large enough and vocal enough to be noticed by the emperor and worthy of persecution in Rome. Okay, that's all I'm going to say about that. Archaeology. Now, I think it's fair to say the archaeological finds from Judea and Galilee provide a generally supportive picture of the details that appear in the Gospels and letters of Paul. For example, I'll just talk about that one picture on the left-hand side there. That's a foot bone. And you can see there's a nail through it. That foot bone was found in a Jewish tomb in Jerusalem. Now, prior to that foot bone being found, if you'd asked historians what happened to the victims of crucifixion, they'd have said, without exception, they were basically taken outside, thrown in the municipal rubbish dump outside Jerusalem, where they were eaten by wild animals and dogs. The finding of that foot bone clearly indicates that one person got a proper Jewish burial after his crucifixion. And of course that ties up with the detail in the Gospel, the detail of what happens to Jesus in the Gospel. Now, it's not Jesus' foot bone, of course, but It provides a generally corroborative piece of information that ties up with the details in the Gospels. Maybe I should tell you about this. I like a pointer. It's good for crowd control, if there's a crowd. But I got this on Amazon, and I folded it up, and I put it in this backpack. I completely forgot about it, and I was rummaging through the backpack about 6 months later, and I found my pointer, and I thought, brilliant, I found my pointer. But then I realised, to my horror, was that? That's all right. Then I realised that this pointer and this bag had been through Glasgow Airport security, Edinburgh Airport security, Heathrow, Charles de Gaulle, and Schiphol. So, if you want to hijack a plane, get one of these. You didn't hear it here, okay? Okay, right. Anyway, right. So, okay. So these then are the sources of evidence we have for Jesus. You and I can use and draw upon to understand who Jesus was and is. So, when examining the evidence, what do today's historians agree upon regarding the life of Jesus? Well, when I was doing my research into who Jesus is, I read a book by the historian Professor E.P. Sanders called The Historical Figure of Jesus. E.P. Sanders was regarded as a leading figure on research on the historical Jesus. He died a couple of years ago. This particular book was written in 1993. Now, the reason I'm mentioning it only is because Sanders provides in it what he refers to as a list of secure facts about the aftermath, about the life and aftermath of Jesus' life. He says this because these are amongst historians almost beyond dispute. These are: Jesus was born circa 4 BC, near the time of death of Herod the Great. He spent his childhood and early adult years in Nazareth, a Galilean village. He was baptized by John the Baptist. He called disciples. He taught in the towns, villages and countryside of Galilee, but apparently not the cities. He preached the kingdom of God. About the year 30 or 33 AD, he went to Jerusalem for Passover. He had created a disturbance in the temple area. He had a final meal with the disciples. He was arrested and interrogated by Jewish authorities, specifically the high priest, and he was executed on the orders of the Roman prefect Pontius Pilate. Now, Sanders then goes on to provide what he refers to as a short list of equally secure facts about the aftermath of Jesus' life. Again, these are historical facts the majority of today's historians are agreed actually happened after Jesus' death. So, his disciples first fled. The disciples saw Jesus, but in what sense is not certain, after his death. As a consequence, they believed he would return to found the kingdom. And they formed a community to await his return and sought to win others to faith in him as God's Messiah. Now, I wonder if any of you find that list surprising. I know I did when I first read it as an agnostic. I was surprised that the accepted historical view of Jesus' life and its aftermath was so close to being what I understood to be the biblical view. Now, when we look at evidence for the resurrection later on this evening, I'll come back to that list along with some of the circumstantial threads of evidence regarding Christianity I've touched on so far. However, before that, I'd like to briefly look at what the sources tell us about Jesus himself. The sources indicate that Jesus' disciples thought he was the Son of God and the Messiah. Well, were they correct? Okay, I think it's fair to say that for an atheist and agnostic, it's hard to believe the historical figure of Jesus is also the Son of God. So is Christianity therefore based on some massive misunderstanding of who Jesus was? Well, I'd like to take a few minutes to take a look at what the sources tell us about who Jesus was and is. Okay, so it's sometimes suggested that although Jesus saw himself as a teacher and Jewish holy man, he didn't regard himself as the Son of God. Indeed, some have claimed that as a good Jew, Jesus would have regarded such a view of himself as blasphemous. Well, to address that question, I've picked a couple of examples from Mark's Gospel. You'll remember from earlier on that Mark was the Gospel written first, some 30 to 40 years after Jesus died. I've chosen an example from Mark's Gospel to reduce the possibility of Christian theology getting in the way of developing an accurate picture of Jesus' view of himself. Well, when we look at Mark's Gospel, we can see clear evidence of Jesus thinking and acting in a manner consistent with his believing he's the Son of God. For example, in Mark's Gospel, Jesus forgives sins. In the miracle narratives, Jesus sometimes links the physical or mental affliction of the person about to be healed with that person's sinfulness. For example, in Mark chapter 2, he says, "Son, your sins are forgiven," as the precursor to the healing of a paralyzed man. Now, as any good Jew knew, only God can forgive sins. Jesus knew the Jewish scriptures and teachings. In acting this way, he was directly linking himself with God. In Mark it says that the Jewish religious authorities also realized this and accused him of blasphemy as a result. In Mark's Gospel, Jesus teaches on his own authority. Now, this might appear as a bit of a technicality, but in Judaism you required two people to conduct religious teaching. One to witness what the other was saying, and vice versa. Jesus, however, makes a point of teaching alone. He precedes many of his teachings with the words, "I tell you the truth." Well, so what, you might say? Well, any other Jewish teacher in the first century would say something like, "I tell you the truth, and here's a teacher standing next to me that'll verify I'm telling the truth." So why is that important? Well, a Jewish audience would know that only God can teach on his own authority. Again, Jesus is directly linking himself with God by teaching in that particular way. Now, in Mark's Gospel, he refers to God as Father or Abba. And that's Aramaic for dad or daddy. Well, so what, you might say again? Isn't God regularly referred to as Father in the Christian church? Doesn't mean that Christians believe that God is their actual biological father. Now, I guess the problem here is we're used to a Christian view of having an intimate father-child relationship with God. A relationship, of course, modelled on Jesus' relationship with God. As a result, it's been common in the last 2,000 years to refer to God as Father. However, to first century Jews, calling God Father would be blasphemous. Jews weren't even allowed to mention God's name, that is the tetragram YHWH. So to refer to God as Dad or Daddy would be seen by Jews as downright eccentric, as well as blasphemous, unless of course you actually were God's son. Also, in Mark's Gospel, the miracles had symbolic meaning. Some of the miracles have symbolic meaning to those that were performed in front of. Some of the miracles were performed in such a way as to link Jesus to such Jewish figures as Moses, Elijah, Joshua, and so on. Now, another miracle, the calming of the storm, also suggested to those who witnessed it that Jesus was God. In this event, Jesus and his disciples are in an open boat on the Sea of Galilee when they're caught in a violent storm. As the wind and waves rage and the boat begins to fill with water, Jesus is sleeping at the back of the boat on a cushion. The disciples wake him up shouting, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" Jesus then gets up, shouts at the waves, "Quiet, be still." At that, the storm immediately abates. Jesus then gives his disciples a hard time for the lack of faith in him. Now, at this time, Jews believed that only God had control of the elements. Further, Jews believed that Satan's home was under the waters of seas and lakes. For Jesus to take control of the wind and waves in that way was a clear sign to his followers that he was God and that he had control over Satan. No wonder the disciples were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and waves obey him." So in summary, I think it's fair to say that these points don't provide conclusive proof that Jesus is the Son of God. However, it certainly indicates that it was very likely that he thought of himself in that particular way. Okay, I think we'd all agree if someone thinks they're the Son of God today, we'd agree they were massively deluded. So, was Jesus also severely deluded to think of himself in that way? Well, in the booklet we look at what professional psychologists think of Jesus' mental condition when they review the sources of evidence we've got. And the conclusion they come to, and we come to, is there's no direct evidence or even hints of evidence suggesting Jesus was exhibiting any of the behaviour patterns associated with delusional behaviour. Okay, so it looks like from what I've just said that Jesus saw himself as the Son of God and Messiah, and there are no clues to suggest he was massively deluded. But what if he unintentionally misled them? What if he sincerely believed he was the Son of God but was just wrong? Alternatively, what if he deliberately misled the disciples? What if he had some other agenda for saying he was the Son of God? What if all those miracles and healings were actually sleight of hand, deceptions, magic tricks? Now, these are reasonable questions, and I'll spend a couple of minutes looking at them individually. Let's start with the unintentional one. Now, we just discussed a minute ago whether Jesus was severely deluded, mad if you prefer, to think he was the Son of God. My guess is we're probably all quite comfortable with concluding it's unlikely Jesus had serious mental health problems. But what if he unintentionally misled his followers? What if he sincerely believed he was the Son of God but was just wrong? Now, this is a common argument put forward by non-Christians. To quote our old friend Richard Dawkins in The God Delusion, page 92 of the hardback version, if you want to check, Richard Dawkins writes, "A fourth possibility, almost too obvious to need mentioning, is that Jesus was honestly mistaken that he was the Son of God. Plenty of people are honestly mistaken about all kinds of things." Well, indeed, plenty of people are honestly mistaken about all kinds of things. It doesn't make them mad. I've been honestly mistaken about all kinds of things in my life. However, if I stood up here right now, took off my specs, looked at you, tried to focus on, provide a focused look on you, and I said to you, "I'm the Son of God." No, I'm not kidding. I am the Son of God. I know it's a bit difficult to get your head around what with this lack of hair and this accent and this wee check shirt, but I am the Son of God. What would you think? Well, probably the politest thing you would think is I probably need a wee sit down and a drink of water to clear my head, so I'm just going to have a wee drink of water just now. So what am I saying? I'm saying you can't have it both ways. If you think you're God, then you're either wrong in the head or you are God. Further, if you think you're God and are prepared to do something about it by going on a mission that collects followers, challenges the established religious order, and ends up getting you killed, then you really are wrong in the head, or God. So given what I've just said, it's pretty unlikely he unintentionally misled his followers. Well, could he have deliberately misled them? Now, we know of some other messianic and charismatic leaders in the past who have deliberately misled their followers. Well, these two fellas up here. I take it you're familiar with these two characters. So Jim Jones, the fellow on the right, so the left, he was the head of the Branch Davidian cult, and Jim Jones was also ran a cult down in Guyana. It all ended up very messily for them and their followers. So, why am I showing these people? Well, I put a couple of biographies of these fellas in the booklet. They just look nothing like Jesus. you know, you compare these fellas to the details we have of Jesus in the Gospels. Jesus just doesn't look like anything like these monsters. I suppose what I'm getting at here is, if you're prepared to mislead your followers, you're probably prepared to do a whole lot of other things as well. And that's what they did. But do the comparisons yourself, make your own mind up. So from a more detailed review in the Jesus the Evidence booklet, it looks like Jesus thought he was the Son of God. It looks like he wasn't mad or delusional. It's very unlikely he knowingly or unknowingly misled the disciples. So what we're left with? Maybe, just maybe, he was who he said he was. So what I'd like to do now is have a short break. After the break, I'd like to move on to the one key event on which the existence of Christianity rests. That is the death and resurrection of Jesus. Is there compelling evidence to support the resurrection being an actual historical event? Thank you. Let's go and get a cup of tea. Hello.